Christmas was supposed to be warm. The kind of warm that came from glowing lights, familiar voices, and the comfort of being surrounded by people who knew you. Outside, snow fell gently onto quiet streets, softening the world. Inside the house, everything looked picture perfect. Twinkling decorations, wrapped gifts stacked neatly by the tree, and the rich scent of holiday food drifting through the air. From the outside, this home looked like happiness. Inside, Emma stood near the doorway, holding her coat just a second longer than necessary. She always did that. Paused, breathed in, prepared herself. Family gatherings had a way of turning into quiet tests she never signed up for. She wasn't nervous. She was tired. Emma had been away for years, building a life that didn't fit into neat explanations. While others climbed traditional ladders, she built something invisible, something that only existed on screens, contracts, and numbers no one here ever asked about. And tonight, she already knew how the conversation would go. The dining room buzzed with excitement. Laughter echoed. Compliments were exchanged. Success stories floated easily across the table. Emma slipped into her seat without ceremony. Her laptop bag rested at her side, worn but carefully kept. To everyone else, it looked like a habit she hadn't outgrown. To Emma, it was proof. Proof of late nights, failed starts, quiet wins, and sacrifices no one had seen. At the head of the table, her mother moved gracefully, hosting, smiling, making sure everything was just right. She looked proud, just not of Emma. This wasn't new. Since childhood, Emma had learned the difference between being loved and being approved of. She had always been the confusing one. The one who didn't follow the script. The one who promised she'd make it work, someday. And every Christmas, that promise was quietly questioned. No one knew that this year was different. No one knew that behind Emma's calm expression was a truth so large it could shatter every assumption in the room. That the same job they dismissed as unstable had grown into something powerful. Something real. And no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what would happen when that truth finally revealed itself. Because by the end of the night, Christmas wouldn't just be remembered for gifts and laughter. It would be remembered as the moment everything changed. The day my husband died, I learned how quiet the world could be. The funeral was held under a grey sky, the kind that feels heavy even before it rains. I stood beside his coffin, my hands clenched together so tightly they hurt, afraid that if I let go, I would fall apart completely. People came, neighbors, colleagues, distant acquaintances, faces filled with sympathy, voices low and careful. But the faces I searched for never appeared. I kept looking toward the entrance, telling myself they might be late. My parents. My siblings. My best friend. The one who knew every chapter of my life. Every few minutes, my heart lifted with false hope. And every time, it sank again. They never came. As prayers were recited and flowers were placed, a strange numbness wrapped around me. I wasn't just burying my husband, I was burying the belief that blood and history guaranteed loyalty. The man I loved lay before me, and the people who raised me chose absence. My husband had never been perfect, but he had been kind. He stood by me when I chose love over approval, when I walked away from expectations that never felt like mine. My family never forgave that. To them, my marriage was rebellion. To me, it was home. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, my knees nearly gave out. A stranger caught my arm, whispering words of comfort. A stranger, not my mother, not my father, not the friend who once swore she'd never let me face pain alone. That was the moment it truly hit me. I was alone. Not because my husband was gone, but because everyone else had already left. As people slowly dispersed, I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the earth that now separated me from the one person who had chosen me without conditions. The wind was cold, but it was the emptiness that hurt more. I didn't cry loudly. I didn't scream or collapse. I simply felt something inside me crack, not loudly, but permanently. And deep down, though I didn't know it yet, that crack was where a new version of me would begin. The real pain didn't come at the funeral. It came after. After the prayers ended. After the strangers left. After the world decided it was time to move on. I returned to the house we had built together, carrying grief like a second skin. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and suddenly the silence became unbearable. There was no one to ask if I had eaten. No one to sit beside me and say nothing. No one to help me remember how to breathe. His presence was everywhere. His mug still sat by the sink. His jacket hung on the chair, exactly where he had left it. I reached for it without thinking, and then froze. My hands trembled as I pressed my face into the fabric, inhaling what little of him remained. That was when I finally cried. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind that shakes your chest and leaves you empty afterward. I checked my phone. Still nothing. No missed calls. No messages. No voice notes filled with regret or concern. Not from my parents. Not from my siblings. Not from my best friend. I told myself not to be surprised. They had disapproved of my marriage from the beginning. They said I had ruined my future. That I would come back one day, broken and apologetic. But even knowing all that, I never imagined they would abandon me at my lowest moment. Grief is heavy, but rejection makes it heavier. That night, I sat on the floor of the living room, my back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Memories played in my head like scenes from a life that suddenly felt unreal. Laughter, arguments, plans that would never happen. And in between all of it, one painful realization kept returning. The man I lost had chosen me every day. The people who raised me couldn't choose me once. Somewhere in that long, sleepless night, something inside me shifted. I didn't become strong. I didn't become fearless. But I became aware. Aware that if I survived this alone, I would never beg for belonging again. Aware that love given conditionally was not love at all. Aware that my grief would not destroy me, but it would change me. As the first light of morning crept through the window, I wiped my tears and stood up. My legs felt weak, but my mind was strangely clear. I was still broken. Still mourning. Still lonely. But I was no longer waiting. 3 days passed after the funeral. The world outside kept moving, cars, voices, routines, but inside the house, time felt frozen. I moved slowly, as if any sudden motion might break me again. I wasn't ready to let go, yet I couldn't stay trapped in stillness either. That morning, I decided to sort through my husband's things. Not to erase him. Just to feel close to him. I began with the study. His desk was neat, exactly how he always kept it. Files aligned. Pens placed carefully. It made my chest ache. He had always been so intentional, so thoughtful, even in small things. As I opened one of the drawers, my fingers brushed against a sealed envelope. My name was written on it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I sat down before opening it, my hands shaking as if they already knew what was inside. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than words. I opened it slowly. If you're reading this, the letter began. Then I'm not there anymore. And I'm sorry you're facing this alone. Tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. He wrote about knowing his time might be limited. About worrying what would happen to me after he was gone. He mentioned my family, not with anger, but with understanding. He knew they might not stand by me. He knew I would be tested. But he also knew me. I've seen your strength, he wrote. Even when you didn't see it yourself. The letter went on to explain that he had prepared everything quietly, our finances, our home, our future security. Everything was legally arranged in my name. Not as a surprise, but as protection. I never wanted you to feel dependent on anyone after me, he wrote. Not on family. Not on sympathy. Not on fear. I pressed the letter against my chest and cried harder than I had since the funeral. This wasn't just grief, it was love reaching me from beyond loss. He had chosen me, even in death. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. A courier handed me a registered envelope. The sender's name made my stomach tighten. It was from my family. Inside was no apology. No concern. Just formal language, questions about assets, vague references to responsibility, and a request to discuss matters. I read it once. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was clear. They hadn't come when I was grieving. They hadn't come when I was broken. They came when they thought there was something to claim. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside my husband's. And for the first time since his death, I felt something solid form inside me. Not anger, not revenge, but resolve. They thought I was alone. They didn't realize. I had already been prepared. They didn't come together. They never did things together when it mattered. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, yet somehow I knew who it would be. Some instincts are born from pain. I opened the door slowly, and there they were. My parents. My brother. And behind them, standing slightly apart, my best friend. The same people who couldn't stand beside me when I buried my husband. For a moment, no one spoke. Their eyes searched my face, as if they expected to see weakness, red eyes, trembling hands, a woman desperate for comfort. What they saw instead unsettled them. I stepped aside and let them in. We sat in the living room, surrounded by memories they had never respected. My husband's photograph hung quietly on the wall. No one looked at it. Especially not my father. My mother broke the silence first. "We heard you weren't well," she said, her voice careful, controlled. Not "I'm sorry." Not "how are you surviving." Just words meant to test the ground. "I buried my husband alone," I replied calmly. "That answers your question." The room stiffened. My brother cleared his throat. "There are some things we need to talk about. Practical matters." I nodded slowly. Of course. Practical matters always arrive after emotions become inconvenient. My best friend finally looked at me. Her eyes were glossy, uncertain. "I wanted to come to the funeral," she said softly. Everything became complicated. I met her gaze without anger. "Grief isn't complicated," I said. "Choices are." Silence followed. Then my father spoke, firm, authoritative, like he always had. "We need clarity about what your husband left behind. These situations require responsibility." That was it. Not concern. Not regret. Just entitlement wrapped in seriousness. "He left clarity," I said. "And protection." Their expressions changed. Slightly. Enough for me to notice. My mother leaned forward. "You don't have to be defensive. We're family." I held her gaze. Family doesn't disappear when life becomes uncomfortable. No one argued with that. For the first time, I realized something deeply important. They were uncomfortable. Not because of grief, but because I wasn't bending. "You didn't come for me," I continued. "You came because you assumed I'd need you. That I'd return. That I'd be unsure." My brother frowned. "You're making this bigger than it is." "No," I replied quietly. "I'm finally seeing it clearly." When they stood to leave, my mother paused near the door. Her voice cracked, not convincingly, but enough to sound human. "You've changed," she said. "Yes," I answered. Losing him showed me who stayed, and who didn't. The door closed behind them. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Control. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of paper and polish. It was quiet, professional, and strangely grounding. I sat across from the desk, hands folded in my lap, listening as the man in front of me spoke with calm certainty. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. Those words alone brought a lump to my throat. He slid a thick folder toward me. Inside were documents, deeds, bank records, insurance policies. Each one signed, stamped, and carefully organized. Everything had been transferred into my name months ago. Legally. Completely. "He wanted to make sure you were protected," the lawyer continued. "In every possible way." I took a slow breath. For days, I had felt like I was walking on unstable ground. Now, suddenly, the ground felt solid. "There's something else," he added, flipping to another page. "A special clause." I looked up. "In the event of interference or pressure from extended family, legal or otherwise, immediate action is authorized." I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from realization. My husband had known. He had seen what I hadn't wanted to admit. He had prepared for it without ever making me feel small or dependent. This wasn't about money. It was about dignity. As I left the office, my phone rang. My best friend's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. "They're saying you're being distant," she said quickly. "That you're shutting everyone out." "I'm not shutting anyone out," I replied calmly. "I'm just not explaining myself anymore." She paused. "Your family feels threatened." "That's not my responsibility," I said. The line went quiet. When I reached home, I stood in the living room and looked around. The same walls. The same furniture. But something inside me had changed. The fear that once lived in my chest was gone, replaced by something steadier. Confidence. That night, I placed my husband's letter back in its envelope and locked it away safely. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed to read it to feel strong. He had given me more than protection. He had given me permission to stand on my own. And I intended to use it. The first legal notice arrived on a Monday morning. It was an ordinary envelope, plain, cream-colored, with my name typed neatly on the front. No dramatic markings. No urgency written in red. And yet, the moment I held it in my hands, I felt the weight of intention behind it. This wasn't concern. This wasn't family reaching out. This was strategy. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it on the table and stared at it for a long time, as if the paper itself might speak. In the past, something like this would have terrified me. A letter from my family, especially one involving legal matters, would have sent me into panic. I would have questioned myself, doubted my choices, wondered where I had gone wrong. But this time was different. This time, I felt calm. Not because I was fearless, but because I was prepared. When I finally opened the envelope, the language inside was cold and carefully worded. Phrases like family interest, fair distribution, and necessary intervention appeared again and again. There was no mention of grief. No acknowledgement of my loss. No apology for abandoning me when I needed them most. It was as if my husband had died only on paper, reduced to assets, accounts, and property. I read the notice once. Then twice. And then I smiled. Not out of arrogance. Out of clarity. I forwarded the notice to my lawyer without adding a single comment. An hour later, my phone rang. "This is weak," he said the moment I answered. Emotion dressed as authority. They don't have a legal leg to stand on. He explained everything patiently, how the notice relied on intimidation rather than law, how there was no claim strong enough to challenge a properly executed will, how my husband's preparations had closed every door they were now trying to force open. Then, he said something that stayed with me. "Your husband didn't just protect you financially," he said. "He protected your future from manipulation." For the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to relief. But my family didn't stop there. 2 days later, the phone calls began. Not directly at first. An aunt I barely spoke to called just to check in. A cousin messaged me with concern thinly disguised as curiosity. Old family friends suddenly remembered my existence. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Gentle questions that slowly turned into suggestions, advice, pressure. "Maybe you should talk to them. They're worried about you. This is getting too serious." I listened quietly. Then I ended each conversation politely. Because I understood something they didn't yet realize. This wasn't about resolving conflict. This was about reclaiming control they had lost. When that didn't work, they escalated. My father called next. His voice was controlled, but strained, the voice of a man unused to resistance. "You didn't need to involve lawyers," he said. I leaned back in my chair, phone resting lightly against my ear. "You involved them first," I replied. I only responded. He exhaled sharply. "You're making this public." I corrected him calmly. "I'm making it lawful." There was silence on the line. Thick, uncomfortable. "You're being influenced," he said finally. I almost laughed. "I was influenced," I said. "By being abandoned. By being underestimated. By being left alone at a funeral." That conversation ended without resolution. The next call came from my mother. Her tone was different. Softer. Emotional. You're hurting the family, she said. People are talking. That sentence told me everything. Not you're hurting us. Not you're hurting yourself. Just reputation. Just image. I was hurting long before people started talking, I said. You just didn't notice. She tried guilt. She tried nostalgia. She tried reminding me of everything they had done for me growing up. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt the old pull. The familiar ache of wanting approval. Wanting to be understood. But then I remembered standing beside my husband's grave alone. And the feeling passed. I'm not fighting you, I said quietly. I'm protecting myself. That was when her voice broke. We thought you would come back, she admitted. That without him, you would need us. There it was. The truth. They hadn't abandoned me because they didn't care. They abandoned me because they believed my independence would collapse without him. And now, they were afraid, because it hadn't. The legal response from my lawyer went out the next morning. It was firm. Precise. Unemotional. It referenced the will. The notarization. The protective clause. And finally, it warned that continued pressure would be considered harassment and met with legal consequences. Within days, the tone shifted. The confidence disappeared. Meetings were cancelled. Notices were withdrawn. Conversations became cautious. And then something unexpected happened. They grew quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet, the defeated kind. I began to understand something deeply important during that time. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it withdraws when it realizes it has lost. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I reflected on how far I had come in such a short time. Just weeks ago, I was a grieving widow standing alone at a funeral. Now, I was someone my family no longer knew how to confront. Not because I had become cruel, but because I had become unmovable. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't trying to humiliate them. I simply refused to be controlled. And that refusal changed everything. The war they started wasn't loud or violent, but it was real. It was fought with words, pressure, expectations, and fear. And without realizing it, they had already lost. Because the woman they expected to break had learned how to stand. I never told my story. That was the irony of it all. I didn't post online. I didn't cry to relatives. I didn't defend myself in public or explain my choices to people who hadn't earned the right to hear them. I believed silence would keep things contained, quiet, manageable. But silence doesn't stay neutral forever. Especially when people use it to rewrite the truth. It started with whispers. At first, they reached me indirectly. Someone would call and ask, "Are you okay? I heard things are tense with your family." Another would message, carefully choosing words, trying to sound neutral while fishing for details. The same sentence kept repeating itself in different voices. People are talking. That's when I understood. They had started talking first. My family, backed into a corner legally, had shifted tactics. If they couldn't control the situation through authority or pressure, they would control the narrative. Quietly. Strategically. I was being framed as unstable. Emotional. A grieving widow who had lost perspective. Someone who needed guidance. Supervision. Intervention. They weren't accusing me directly. They were planting doubt. What they didn't realize was that truth has weight. And when enough people feel it missing, they start asking questions. The first crack appeared at a family gathering I didn't attend. Someone asked why no one from my immediate family had gone to my husband's funeral. The room went quiet. There was no convincing answer. No explanation that didn't sound cruel or calculated. The truth, simple and uncomfortable, hung in the air longer than anyone expected. More questions followed. Why were legal notices sent to a widow days after burial? Why had the matter escalated so quickly? Why was there no attempt at reconciliation before lawyers got involved? My family had answers prepared, but answers only work when they're believable. And theirs weren't. Soon, concern replaced curiosity. Concern turned into judgment, not of me, but of them. People who had once admired my parents' composure and control began to look at them differently. With distance. With caution. With doubt. I still said nothing. And that silence became my strength. One afternoon, a distant aunt called me in tears. Her voice shook as she apologized, for not coming to the funeral, for believing what she had been told, for realizing too late that something was wrong. "I didn't know they left you alone," she said. "If I had known, I would have been there." I thanked her gently. But I didn't reopen the door. Because this wasn't about gathering sympathy. This was about letting truth stand without decoration. Then came the moment my family couldn't control. A respected elder, someone whose opinion carried weight they couldn't ignore, requested a private meeting with them. He had listened. Observed. Asked questions of his own. His conclusion was direct. "You misjudged her," he said. "And now the family's reputation is suffering because of it." That sentence traveled fast. Faster than any rumor. That evening, my brother called me. His voice was tight. Controlled. But the confidence that once defined him was gone. "This has gone too far," he said. "People are questioning our intentions." I replied calmly, "They should." He paused. "You wanted this." "No," I corrected him. "I endured it." That was the moment I realized something final. I was no longer part of their damage control. They couldn't use my silence against me anymore, because it had already done its work. Without reaction, without explanation, without visible weakness, their version of events collapsed under its own weight. The truth didn't need me to speak. It had found its voice. And for the first time since my husband's death, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because I knew what this meant. They were running out of ground. Out of excuses. Out of influence. And soon, they would have to face what they had done, without me shielding them from it. They didn't send messages this time. They didn't ask for a meeting through relatives or lawyers. There was no preparation, no warning. My mother came alone, late in the evening, standing at my door with a face that carried exhaustion more than anger. I knew immediately, this wasn't about power anymore. It was about loss. I let her in without a word. She walked slowly through the living room, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. Or perhaps realizing that she no longer belonged in it. The house no longer felt like something connected to her authority. It felt like mine. "You've made things very difficult," she said finally, sitting down. I stayed standing. "Things were already difficult," I replied. "I was just handling them quietly." She folded her hands together, a habit she used whenever she felt cornered. "People are judging us," she said. "They're saying we abandoned you." I nodded once. "Because you did." The honesty startled her. "We didn't think you'd survive on your own," she admitted after a pause. "We thought you'd need us. That you'd come back." That sentence carried more truth than she realized. "You left because you thought I'd return weaker," I said calmly. "But I didn't." Her voice cracked. "Do you know what this is doing to the family name?" I looked at her then, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman who had outgrown it. "I know what it did to me," I said. That mattered more. Silence filled the room. Thick and heavy. "I want my daughter back," she whispered. "You can have me," I said softly. "Just not the version of me you controlled." Tears rolled down her face, not dramatic, not performative. Real. Regretful. Too late. She stood up slowly, defeated in a way I had never seen before. "I don't recognize you anymore," she said. "That's because I finally recognize myself," I replied. When she left, she closed the door gently. And in that quiet moment, I understood something final. This wasn't a victory. It was an ending. The chaos didn't end with arguments or apologies. It ended with distance. Slowly, deliberately, like a door being closed without a sound. Days passed after my mother's visit, and nothing followed. No calls. No messages. No intermediaries. The urgency that once surrounded me dissolved, leaving behind a strange calm. It felt unfamiliar at first, like waiting for another wave after the sea has already pulled back. But the wave never came. The legal tension faded quietly. No new notices. No threats masked as concern. My lawyer confirmed what I already felt: they had stopped. Not because they had changed, but because they had realized they couldn't win. The truth had become too visible. Whispers that once worked in their favor now circled back to them. People noticed patterns. Timelines didn't add up. Questions remained unanswered. And in communities like ours, unanswered questions speak louder than accusations. I wasn't invited to gatherings anymore. At first, that stung. I wondered if I had been erased. Then I realized something liberating. I had been released. I was no longer expected to perform peace, to smooth over discomfort, to protect a reputation that had never protected me. My best friend disappeared completely. No explanations. No final message. Just absence. And strangely, that hurt less than I expected. Some bonds don't break, they simply reveal how thin they always were. Life inside my home began to change. I rearranged furniture. Opened windows. Let light in. I stopped living carefully around grief and started living intentionally around healing. Some days were heavy, yes. Grief doesn't vanish. But it no longer defined every moment. One evening, I stood in front of my husband's photograph and spoke aloud, not in sadness, but in peace. "I'm okay," I told him. "You don't need to worry anymore." And for the first time, I believed it. My family's influence had always relied on my silence, my compliance, my need for belonging. Without those, they had nothing to hold over me. I wasn't celebrated. I wasn't condemned. I was simply free. And sometimes, freedom arrives quietly, when no one is watching. And nothing is demanded of you anymore. Time did not erase my grief. It reshaped it. Weeks turned into months, and somewhere between ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, I realized I was no longer surviving, I was living. Not the life I had planned, not the one I imagined growing old into, but a life that belonged entirely to me. I stopped measuring my days by loss. I began measuring them by peace. I visited my husband's grave one early morning, when the world was still half asleep. There were no tears that day. Just gratitude. I told him about the house, about how I had learned to sit in silence without feeling afraid. About how I no longer waited for approval from people who had failed me. I told him he had been right about me. Then I let him rest. My family remained distant. Not hostile. Not apologetic. Just gone. And that was okay. I no longer needed them to understand me. Some people are chapters. You don't carry them into every season of your life. I forgave them quietly. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. My best friend never returned. And in her absence, I learned something valuable. Loyalty is proven in moments of discomfort, not comfort. I didn't replace her. I didn't rush to fill the space she left behind. I learned to enjoy my own company. The house slowly became mine, not a monument to what I lost, but a foundation for what remained. I redecorated, donated, planted new things. I opened windows and let fresh air move through rooms that once felt heavy with memory. And one evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I understood the truth I had been building toward all along. I was never weak for loving deeply. I was never wrong for choosing my own life. And I was never abandoned because I was unworthy. I survived betrayal. I survived silence. I survived loss. And in doing so, I discovered a version of myself no one could take away. I wasn't the woman left alone at a funeral anymore. I wasn't the daughter waiting to be chosen. I wasn't defined by grief. I was someone who learned to stand, quietly, firmly, without permission. And that was the life I chose to keep.